This was actually planned by the spiritual benefactors who understand our deep spiritual needs, and in this particular case, also understand our need for a little bit of caffeine. Perhaps that's what Paul said when he wrote to the Ephesians and said, "Awaken you who sleep, rise from the dead, and the Christ shall give you life." Um, but it's been a very great day so far, full of learning, full of wonderful lessons for us to digest and contemplate as we begin to think about, um, what does it really mean to be a spiritist? What does it really mean to be a human? As Susanna was saying, what does it really mean to put in perspective all the 10 years of work that the Spiritist Society of Chicago has been doing? What does it all mean? And ultimately, we've talked about personal transformation, about all of this being here for us to be able to leverage the existing tools that we have at our disposal to change ourselves. And why? Why do we want to change? Because we want to be happier. Because we want to feel the joy that we sometimes feel in this world, but we want to do it in a constant and maintained way. That's why we do what we do. We want to be closer to God. Because that's what it is. That joy comes from being closer to our true nature, to our true and ultimate selves. And we've talked about the activities, we talked about love and relationships, we talked about transformation, and this is one more case that we hope to bring to you of perhaps one of the greatest personal transformations we have notice of, the transformation of Saul from Tarsus to Paul. And in the next couple of minutes, we want to investigate a little bit the symbolism of that transformation, not because it's one that is documented in the Bible or we see that in other wonderful books, but because he has a lot to teach us about our own, because it could be transferable to our daily lives. I know that sometimes when we talk about these names from the New Testament or the Old Testament, they seem so far away, they seem so disconnected from where we are today as a society where we have the internet and immediate connectivity and we're moving around. It's so easy for all of us. But fundamentally, these stories have lasted for so long because they are transferable to our day-to-day lives. And that's what we hope to convince. So we're going to analyze a little bit the symbolism of the road to Damascus and ask ourselves, what is our road to Damascus? And we're going to do that hopefully without sleeping. And that itself will be our greatest accomplishment for the day. Are you with me so far? Yeah. All right. There you go. Okay, so to talk about our road to Damascus, really, we want to talk about Paul, because what we know of Paul, it's sometimes daunting. We know Paul as Saint Paul. I mean, you got the word saint before your name. You're a big deal, right? And sometimes that puts those people like Peter, as Susanna was saying, or Paul, in a different level from us. Or I should say, we put them on a different level from us because we only see the final product. We don't see the struggle. We don't see the process of change, right? Paul, no doubt, has wonderful, wonderful things to his resume. If you think about it, he was oftentimes referred as the apostle of the Gentiles. He was the one who took the message to those who were non-Jews. Gentiles means just that, right? And in a way, I believe that what we know of Christianity today, it is because of Paul. We have his writings, we have a lot of his books, because he was able to leave the Jerusalem area. And as things changed and went back sort of to what they were before. In many different occasions, we see that we have the original writings and a different perspective on Christianity because of the message that Paul took to the whole known world at the time. And he's such a big figure in our Christianic tradition that if you think about the New Testament, which is really 27 books put together into just one place, and perhaps it warrants a conversation in a future time of why those 27 books are the ones that are there, right? Out of those 27 books, we know that 4 of them are the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, right? Luke, and John, right? So it leaves 23. One of them is the Acts of the Apostles, so it leaves 22. One of them is the Apocalypse, so it leaves really like 21, right? Out of those 13 are letters that Paul wrote. So it's a sizable chunk of the New Testament comes through, allegedly, through Paul, although some historians may disagree with some of those letters not being written by Paul. But you can see here that his picture and his image looms large in our Christian tradition, right? And he does for many different reasons. Those letters were really ways of communicating and nurturing these different places that he had been, because he walked for a while, guys. If we actually dive into the map of the known world at the time, we can kind of see here that, he kind of starts all the way over here, and he walks through all these parts of the world and many times ends up all the way here in Rome. And although for us today, that's not a big piece of the world because the world has gotten smaller with globalization, I am just going to remind you that this was done walking and through boats sometimes, right? And if you consider today that most of us, before the 1900s, would not adventure farther than 10 miles or 20 miles from where we were born, these are big walkings over here, right? And everywhere he goes, he leaves a message, and he leaves a new group, and he leaves those messages behind. So he's really an incredible worker for the idea of Christianity and the promotion of Christianity, and rightly so. He's done amazing things. So when we look at Paul, we see all these incredible things, and we put him in this pedestal, and we put him in this place that is just, it's not relatable to us. But we forget that before he was Paul, he was first Saul. And if we think about it, it might be interesting for us to just understand a little bit of all of this before we dive into his own personal transformation. Because you cannot understand Paul without Saul, and you cannot have Paul without Saul. And I think that's a good thing for us to do. So if we think about it, Saul was born in the city of Tarsus to a family of means. So he was very educated, highly educated, spoke a couple of languages, which was at the time. A Jew, of course, and as he grew older, he displayed incredible abilities, intellectual abilities. He was really smart. He was great on his feet, thinking and talking and on reason. And he was very devout Jew. He really believed in the law. And it's also very important for us to understand that at that time, there was no distinction for the Jews from religion and politics. It was one thing. You lived under one rule, one law, right? So as a driven man, continues to try to advance in the world, he rises to the highest possible levels of the Jewish faith and order. Eventually, he joins the Sanhedrin, which was the ultimate body of Jewish law, and he's made it, right? He's got everything going for him. He's extremely young. He's extremely successful. People know that he's a star, and he's got everything going, including a beautiful wife, future wife by the name of Abigail that he has met, who's also extremely devout. And this is a story I will briefly tell you, but you can find in a fantastic book, Paul and Stephen, that's worth a read, which is brought to us via the hands of the medium Francis Xavier, through the writings of the Spirit Emmanuel, who narrates the story of Paul and Stephen, the first martyr of Christianity, who is really incredible. And we'll tell you a little bit of the story, and then we will then dive into the symbolism of the story Of course, I will do no justice to the story. I will never be able to tell it in such a lyrical way as you can find for yourself in the book. So go over there and read that book if you can. It's just this thick. It's just this thick. You can do that quickly. Like maybe if you don't stop, for a water or food, you probably do this in a day, right? But in that story, we're told all of this, and we're also told that Paul falls in love with Abigail, and he seems to have everything figured out. He's truly excited. She's really excited because she has also found, a man who cares about God, and that's very important to her. And for reasons that we're not going to go into, she really wants him to meet her brother as well, because they've been separated and estranged for different reasons. And she actually asks Paul to help find them for a lot of reasons. But it turns out that, that they're not together at that moment in time. And Paul, as he is a great defender of Judaism, also knows that there is this young prophet called Jesus from Nazareth, who has been walking around and getting people's attention away from Judaism a little bit. And he's worried about this cult, right? Who are these people who are, perverting the law? And so as a young, up-and-coming rising star, he starts to go and challenges these followers of Christ and make sure that he sets them straight back into the law, because after all, one must follow God, right? And during that process, eventually he comes across a man by the name of Stephen, who eventually he has some disagreements when it has Stephen stoned to death. But as before Stephen dies, and after he's stoned to death, but before he dies, his wife, who is about to become his wife, Abigail, comes in and actually recognizes that that is her brother. And in that moment, almost dramatic, like a soap opera, but soap operas are dramatic because things like that sometimes happen in real life. He realizes that he has just had his love's brother stoned to death. And worse yet, he had converted to Christianity. And now he's about to marry a woman whose brother was a Christian. And how would that play in his own figure of the defender of the faith? And in that moment, in that impetus, he decides that he's no longer going to marry that woman because he doesn't want to be associated with anybody from Christianity because he hates it so dearly. And then his life is really turned upside down. So he decides he's no longer going to marry Abigail and goes on about his life. Later on, he eventually comes to his senses and he misses her so badly that he knows that she was the love of his life and goes back to her, only to find that this time she's the one who's dying. She got sick. And eventually he meets with her before she passes away, and she has a chance to tell him that she too has converted to Christianity. And while he was away, a very young, a very nice old man would come by and teach her about Christianity, and that's how he was converted. She was converted, and his name was Ananias. And all of a sudden, when Paul feels he was going to be reunited with his love of his life, and his life was already again take shape and go the way he wanted to, she's gone. And now he has a profound pain and hatred for the followers of the Christ who have caused him to separate from his beloved wife and eventually killed her in his eyes. And he's got to blame somebody for all his anger and for all his stuff. So he decides to double down and dedicate himself to the idea of defending his faith and chasing down all the followers of the Christ, especially that man, Ananias, who put all this insane thoughts into Abigail's mind before she passed. And he's heard that Ananias has gone to Damascus to preach in Damascus, so he asked the Sanhedrin for permission to go after Ananias, because he was also well known at the time, and bring him into justice, either arrest him or kill him if necessary. The Sanhedrin acquiesces, agrees, and so Paul, we should say Saul, sets forth to Damascus in search of Ananias. in a mission of search and destroy, right? A defender of the faith. He does not go alone, right? He does not go alone. The Sanhedrin sends some people to help him. It's a long trip. Remember, we don't have cars. We have horses and camels, right? So things take a while. He's assigned 3 people to go with him, so he's relatively high, so you need some serfs to kind of help stuff. 2 of them are young ones, Demetrius and Jacob, and there is an older serf that he knows as well, closer to him as a friend, Jonah. So 3 of them go, and as they go and take his provisions, they set their way to Damascus. And as they go to the road of Damascus that looks somewhat like this, so clearly not super exciting, no 7-Elevens along the way, no stops, right? It's very, contemplative, I guess we could call it. There's nothing for you to do. This is actually a picture from the region, as I said. Very hot, right? Very difficult. That's why you take all these people with you and all these food, because there isn't really stops along the way. But along the way, as he's going with his people, he feels a little bit lightheaded. He feels as if a shimmery curtain's like opening up, and he gets dizzy. He ends up falling from his mount. And when he falls down, he actually sees this great light coming to him and realizes it's the figure of the Christ. And the figure of the Christ comes to him and says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He goes and, taken in that moment, feeling that energy, which he hadn't perhaps been able to feel until then because he was just all rational about it, understand what's happening, and courageously he asks, "Lord, what would you have me do?" Jesus tells him to go to Damascus still, that he will figure things out. He comes back to himself, and something interesting we notice is those 3 people that were with him, nothing. They did not hear or see Jesus. They did not hear voices. Jacob, the older one, kind of felt there was something different, but couldn't see anything. And Paul now is on the ground saying he's met the Christ, and he is basically converted to the Christ. The 3 of his servants who are with him are like, "Hold on a second," right? Hold on a second. Like, it's really hot. This happens in the desert. He probably just didn't drink enough water, right? And this happens. Let's just kind of get him back into his senses. And it's like, no, no, no. And by the way, I am blind. I cannot see anything. During that vision, I became blind. And they're like, "Oh, this is not good," right? We got to take the boss back to Jerusalem because he's not doing well. Because the guy, our boss is like, he's chasing the followers of Christ. And now he's saying he's like one of them? It makes no sense. And Paul refuses. He says, "Nope, I am going to Damascus." So the 3 of them talk and then decide that the 2 young ones are going to go back and share the news. But Jonah, the older one, realizing and knowing Saul a little bit longer, knows that it's not a good idea to leave a blind man in the desert with no provisions on the way to Damascus, right? A stubborn blind man. And so he decides to help Saul get to Damascus, which they do. They make their way to Damascus. Getting to Damascus, Saul then seeks some of his friends and acquaintances, because remember, he's a well-established person with a lot of political connections and well-known throughout the land. So he seeks some of his friends to be with them, right, and wait and get better, because he's still blind. And they denied him help. They're like, "Oh, hold on a second. You're converted to Christianity? No, I'm sorry, I can't hang out with you." Right? And he realized that those were not friends. They were political acquaintances that really didn't care about him. He seeks his own family. And later on, too, they're also going to do that. But what's ended up happening is his friend Jonah takes him to a bed and breakfast. Let's be honest, it's probably like the Motel 6 of the times, right? Because he's got no cash, no money, right? They've done all their stuff. And they pay for a couple of days. He's there. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do. Christ only told him to go there and wait. And he's decided and resolute to do it. And then his friend Jonah starts to get worried, because any chance he gets, Saul is telling people that he's seen the Christ and he's transformed him. And now Jonah's starting to get worried. Like, I like this guy, but if he's going to start telling everybody that he's with Christ, like, how does this look for me? I don't want to abandon him, but I don't want to be attached to the Christ, right? Because it's not a very favorable social thing to do. After all, we came here to hunt him and his followers. Paul realizes that, and doesn't want to constrain him and lets his friend then go. So what we ultimately find is Paul by himself, Saul, I should say, in a Motel 6 in a dusty city of Damascus with no friends, no money, just waiting. Much to our surprises and to Paul's surprises, guess who shows up a couple of days later to help him? Ananias, who himself had a vision of the Christ, who told him to go to that place and heal Saul of Tarsus. And I can only imagine how the conversation went, right? Imagine Ananias having this beautiful vision of the Christ. Imagine how that is to begin with. I cannot conceive, right? Love, message, overwhelmness, right? And then the Christ says, now I need you to go to Damascus, to that Motel 6, and I need you to heal Saul. And I can hear like Ananias like, Lord, the same Saul that's been hunting people and killing the followers of the Christ, is that the one you want me to go hang out with? And the Christ's like, yep. And it's like, okay. So we see the strength and the faith and conviction of Ananias, right? And he goes. And as he's praying with Paul, he puts his hands, and I think you know the rest of the story. Saul has this moment as he feels as if scales were falling off his eyes, and he sees again. And he has validation one more time that what he experienced was truly an encounter with the Christ. He stays in Damascus, meets the Christians, and learns, and the rest is history, right? Of course, I do no justice to this story whatsoever, but it's the Cliff Notes version of what happens. The story in itself, it's fascinating, but I think what's really more fascinating for me is the symbolism that he has for our daily lives. And today, if you don't mind, I will pick 7 items for reflection. We can pick a lot more, but 7 is such a nice number, right? I thought about 3, but then you make it too short. 11 is like way too long, right? 5 is nice, but 7 feels a little bit more mystical. Maybe you'll pay attention at the end of the day, right? So I'm like, see how this goes. Maybe 7 would be a good thing. But if you're with me there, as we take ourselves as a journey to Damascus, we'll talk about some of the things and then kind of see how that pertains to our daily lives. Are you with me so far? All right. Okay, so as we look in the road to Damascus, I think the first symbolic piece here that's important for us to notice is that he's taking this journey in a group. Remember, he has Demetrius, Jonas, and Jacob with him. But he's alone. When he has that experience, he's the only one that sees the Christ. And you can only imagine how confusing that is for him. But maybe that's not very different than the experiences that we ourselves feel in our lives. Because when we are called to pay attention to spirituality on our path to our own evolution, it happens by ourselves. We can be in the middle of great, wonderful times with our families and our friends. We have people around us. But the calling for the awakening of a spiritual life happens individually. And it's a difficult reality to face. Because it's quite possible that when you begin to awaken to the spiritual world, those who are around you will not recognize it or understand it the same way and at the same pace that you are doing it. So you can be surrounded with those that you love, which you really wish you could carry with you, but you are unable to make that discovery for them. And so the company we keep helps us, but ultimately the journey is an individual one. We have to come to terms that we might have to lose in this journey some of the people that work with us as they too go back to their old ways. And some of them might go with us, but they might not go all the way. But nevertheless, we must proceed because that is our journey. And I think that is a symbolic takeaway from this journey that Paul does to Damascus that applies to us. In that sense, Paul is all of us. The second symbolic moment that is worth talking about as well is that he has a destabilizing meeting. That this pivotal moment in his life, in his spiritual life, is one in which he literally falls off his mount. And there's this moment of confusion. That was his call to awakening. We sometimes imagine that our spiritual awakening will be a moment where we hear, trumpets playing and the skies will part open and the sun will come down and the angels with harps will come and all of a sudden we'll be endowed with wisdom because now we understand and things are going to be wonderful and marvelous. But that's not generally how it goes. Generally, situations in life and the calling to a spiritual awareness destabilize us on our path to places. We're not expecting it. It throws us off our horses. It gets us on the ground and dizzy. And we cannot understand that. So, it seems like a negative thing, but it's necessary to shake up our roots of what it is for us to pay attention that there's something out there. And that meeting with the Christ cannot happen if we are not shaken and pushed off our horse, our perception of the world. That changing and paying attention to the spiritual necessitates departure from everything else that we know and do. And so it destabilizes us. It changes us. And that is to be expected when we think about it. So perhaps it behooves us to break down this idea that our spiritual change process is one that happens always with joy and beautiful moments of happiness. Sometimes we need to be shaken up to pay attention. I think that might be the second symbolism that Paul brings to us. But there's more, because there's at least 7, right? The third one, which I think is fascinating, is the courageous question. You see, when he falls off the horse and he is met with the Christ, and in that moment, which is so out of his ordinary that he cannot deny it's happening, he internalizes all of this really quickly. And he knows that he's in front of the Christ. He doesn't stop and freeze. He doesn't ask what's happening. He takes it all in. He accepts what's happening. He doesn't fight it. And what is the question that he asks? Lord, what would you have me do? It's like, what is it that I need to do that is different than I was doing before? Because I don't know. Everything that I was doing before, I realized that in that moment was not working. I thought it was, but then I fell off my horse. And did he try to climb back into the horse? No, he stayed. And he asked the question, what should I do? Because he recognized there was something greater, more beautiful, and more powerful than he had conceived, and that he had to change the way he was living his life. And sometimes when we are faced with challenges in our lives, whatever they may be, we ought to learn from that advice too. We ought to stop and ask, what I've done, what I am doing is not working the way I expected it to work. What should I do differently? Who can help me? God, can you help me? How often do we call out for help? About what is it that we are going to do or want to do? Not exactly how we want things to end up. Because we ask for help to get the things that we want. But he's not asking for that. He's asking, tell me what is it that I should do? What is it that would be best for me to do? Because I recognize that you know better. Are you with me so far? We'll go through this quickly. We won't stretch ourselves too thin here because it's the end of the day, but there's still room for more. So after the courageous question, which is one that we ought to ask ourselves, we find another interesting piece, the temporary blindness. As he comes out of that encounter with the Christ, he's blind. He can no longer see the world around him. That's very symbolic to the transformations and experiences that we have in the world. Sometimes when we are jolted because of something, we are blind to the universe. We just don't know what happened. We can't see things straight anymore. Our worldview has been shaken up in such a way that everything that we thought worked before does not. And we just don't know what to do. Our conceptions of how the world works and what is important in the world changed. If before he thought that what was important was climbing through the ranks and becoming a member of the Sanhedrin and being a defender of the faith and going to Damascus to persecute Ananias, right? He figured that he had everything down. He knew the plan. He made his plan, and he did that. But as he's going through the road, in the middle of getting there, he's thrown off the horse, and now he's blind. He just doesn't know what's up and down. He cannot go by himself. He needs somebody to help him walk. We get to that level sometimes spiritually when we don't know what to do with our lives. And that is an interesting idea, because we have this idea that we have to have it all figured out. And then sometimes we punish ourselves because we don't have things figured out. And then we doubt ourselves because we think we should have ourselves figured out. And then we lost track of what is it that we are supposed to figure out and start wondering, how come I don't have things figured out? What's wrong with me? Everybody else has things figured out, we think, but nobody does. But we don't talk about it, so we think it's true. We see people walking back and forth, driving back and forth to work, and we figure they all have things figured out, and we're the only ones who doesn't have things figured out. And we don't know that the biggest secret in the universe is nobody knows. Nobody knows what they really want to do. And we have this idea that we know exactly where we have to go, right? Like as if life were a GPS, where you put the address and you get all the directions and you just do it turn by turn and you get to where you want it. And I think that this tells us that if that were so, Jesus would have told them exactly what to do at the moment. But Jesus doesn't. Jesus gives him waypoint navigation in modern terms. That is to say, Jesus says, go to the next turn and wait for instructions. How many times in our lives do we feel like we are like behind the ball because we need to figure it out exactly what we're going to do by this age, or do this or do that? And sometimes all we really need to do is, what is our next step? And when we get there, we'll figure it out what the step is after that. Otherwise, we never move. We sometimes lack the clarity we want, and we ended up never doing anything, waiting for that clarity to happen. We sit waiting instead of acting. And we lose the opportunity. So the temporary blindness in that sense is a blessing in many ways, because it forces us to look outside ourselves and see that we got to change the way we look and navigate the world. That, I think, is one more symbolism of Paul's road to Damascus. Almost there. 4, halfway. 5. Here's a beautiful thing about Paul. When he falls down, he sees Jesus, comes to his senses. I think it would have been perfectly okay in our modern world for us to say, something horrible happened. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to regroup. I'm going to go back to my comfort zone. I'm going to talk to my buddies, right? Demetrius and Jacob went back. Let's all go back and regroup and find out, and then we try this road again. How many times do we do that? How many times does life knock us back and we say, whoa, something happened here, but I don't know what it is. You know what? I'm going to go back to the way I was before. I'm going to try this again. Paul is ahead of us in that sense because he's so courageously ready to go to the next step. He's so open to the idea of really moving forward that he makes the decision that, no, he's going to go ahead. Even though he's blind, right? He's shaken up to his core. He fell off his horse. He is going to continue to go ahead. Even though he sounds irrational, right? Had a vision. Somebody told me to go. I'm going to go. If that happened to one of our friends today, we might call him crazy, right? Because we're still rooted in that group mentality again. But Paul makes the decision to go ahead. And how many of us, in a moment of challenges in our lives, when we're really knocked back, which happens to all of us, independent of social status, perceived happiness, the masks that we put on for each other, how many of us, when we are faced with a challenge that really knocks us back, says, you know what, I'm going to keep going. We have those moments of victory when we do that. And these are beautiful moments, because if we don't go ahead, then we are probably destined to relive the moment. Because it is in those moments that we make the decision, no, I'm going to do this. This is important to me. This moment of expansion is important to me. This moment of growth is more important to me than my comfort. Because we only grow when we are uncomfortable. If we are in a comfortable zone, we are with things that we're familiar with. And we cannot grow when we're just with things that are familiar to us. Growing necessitates being exposed to something different. Growing means dealing with the unknown. Learning means embracing new challenges. It's a mandatory step in our lives, but we forget this for the sake of comfort sometimes. But Paul doesn't, and he decides to go ahead. But here's the good news, though. As he's going through the road and everything seems really hard, right? He's falling off his horse. His friends have partially abandoned him. He's now blind. His whole world has been shaken up. He thought he was going to do something. Now he's doing something else. Things are not looking up from a physical perspective, right? Spiritually, we now know, as we look backwards, that was a key moment for him. He was on his way up. But in that moment, it seems like he's just on his way down. But what happens? He receives unexpected help. He gets to Damascus, to where Motel 6. And who knocks on his door a couple of days later? Ananias. He wasn't expecting Ananias to show up. And he does. And we all go through this. We all get help when we need the most in our lives. Sometimes we might not register it because we're not paying attention, but the help is always there. And sometimes, just sometimes, or maybe most of the times, the help comes from unexpected places, from the people and the situations that we least expect. Maybe that's also a symbolic awareness of the fact that that which is most challenging and that we hate the most is what's going to help us the most. Doing those things that we dread, changing the things that we don't want to change, facing these challenges that are hard, are the best thing that can happen to us. And that we will have help along the way. It's fascinating. I can only imagine when Saul finds out that it's actually Ananias who's knocking at his door. Imagine his change of mindset. Right? Imagine how he must have felt belittled and small, because the man who was going to help him was the one that he actually came to hurt. Hard personal moments of change. Just like we go in our lives when we decide that we're going to do things differently. It hurts. But it hurts because we are being called to the fact that things need to be different and that we are changing. And that's an interesting thing. And here's a fascinating one too to kind of begin to wrap us up, which is he arrives at a different Damascus. The Damascus that he thought he was going to, I think we can agree, was fundamentally different than the Damascus that he arrived at, even though both were the same thing. Geographically speaking, Damascus was the same, but what he thought Damascus was going to mean for him, a moment of victory, of worldly victory, where he would triumphantly walk into the gates of Damascus, find Ananias was, arrest him or kill him, and return triumphant to his life, was not what he found. Instead, he entered Damascus in ignominy, forgotten, abandoned, having to be led by somebody else because he couldn't see, betrayed by those who he called friends, without a dime in his pocket, out of charity, placed in a Motel 6, waiting for somebody to help him. An incredibly different world than he first envisioned. And I ask sometimes if that does not happen to us as well. That the goals that we set for ourselves in this life, of triumphing in the physical world, or having a vision of us entering victorious into life and having the adoration of those around us who call us great things and know that we are wonderful, perhaps is misguided. That the goals that we set for ourselves perhaps need adjustment, that we need to pay attention to the Spirit. That we need to pay attention not what other people think of us, but instead, what is it that we make of ourselves? Because the truth is, we don't take a lot of time to think of ourselves. Not as much time as we take to think about what other people think of us. And Damascus then is a calling for us to let that echo in our hearts and say that those things we seek, that sometimes we are told by the world that are the things that will make us attain fame and satisfaction, might not truly be the ones that nourish our souls. And if Paul were to look back today, do you feel he would feel the pain of Damascus, or do you feel he would be blessing this moment of challenge that he has had? No doubt he would thank God for the challenges he's faced. Mind you, we may not be there yet. We may not yet have this perspective because we're still going through our own road of Damascus. We're still struggling to understand all of this. But now we have a model, we have a symbolic pathway that we know may happen to us in the middle of our lives, which is we embark on this journey towards a Damascus we think will be there, only to find out that as we travel in the group that we want to travel, that the group might not nourish our souls, that they might not understand our needs, and that we may be shaken up in a destabilizing meeting with our own spirituality, which may call us to temporarily be blind to the world around us and revisit our worldview, to understand that we have to ask ourselves a courageous question. What should I do now that I know better? What should I do now that I know that I am an immortal spirit? Should I change the way I evaluate my actions and the world around me? Do I need to lead a different life? Should I reevaluate the way I behave? And then we are asked to make a decision on whether we want to move forward. Because many of us knock on the door of spiritual transformation, but don't open it. We can't go back. We shouldn't go back. We need to make the courageous decision to move forward, to embrace the change that's about to happen, much the same way that the worm embraces the cocoon that will transform him into a butterfly. And we must not forget for a single moment that we are always going to get help from the least expected places. Be it from our challenges, be it from the people that we did not know were there for us, be it from those who were close to us and weren't paying attention, we thought, being for an invisible world that supports us and helps us all the time. We are always getting help. It's just that we are not looking at it. And when we do all of this with certainty, even amidst all the haze and all the doubt, we are going to arrive at the promised land. It might be a different one than we first envisioned, but we may be glad that that is. Because the shiny objects that entertained us when we were children are no longer of interest to us now when we are older. We crave more meaningful interactions. We crave a solution to that emptiness that sometimes we find in our hearts, and we try to stuff with things of the physical world. The living fountain that Susanna spoke to us about. The water that we have been drinking is not enough to quench our thirst. It only does it for a moment. But if we want to quench our immortal thirst that now we must not ignore, we need to change fundamentally the way we look at the world. And that's a beautiful thing about Spiritism, because it makes it easier for us to understand all of this as we're able to demystify the spiritual realm. Anybody can understand if we're willing to put the time and effort. It's written in such a clear and non-mystical way that if you put the effort, you can understand how we came to the realization that we are immortal spirits, created by God, endowed by God with a brilliant future ahead of us, surrounded by others who love us, and if we don't know them, we will, and we will love them, and they will love us. All of this is made clearer through the understanding of our spiritual selves that Spiritism has come to facilitate for some of us who needs this more rational approach to understanding the wisdom of the ages that have been whispered to us by all the different sages of humanity throughout time. They've been repeating the same message: there is a God, and you are a child of the universe. But we have refused to learn. We have, like our friends from our trip, we have gone back to our safety zones amidst the journey. But instead, what we hear now is the calling to go ahead. Because when we do that, as Susanna was aptly saying, it transforms the way we see life, because there is no death. We stop to think about things, and the worries that worried us are gone. We will never die. That is, in fact, exactly what the Christ tells us in John 11. I am the resurrection and the life. That is to say, the teachings of God are the resurrection and the life, because the Christ had no ego. Right? Whoever believes in these teachings, even though they die, will live. And whoever lives by believing in these teachings and understanding that the spiritual world is ever present will never die. And then, in this most pedagogical question that the Christ always asks of those who are trying to understand the world, to make sure that we're not just accepting, but that we're internalizing, he asks, do you believe this? And that is the ultimate question of our times: is there space in your heart for the truths that we already know, that the Christ has come to tell us by his resurrection at the cross? He came perhaps to show us that there is no death. He came back to point to us that all of us will outlive our physical bodies, that that's not who we are, and perhaps we ought to pay less attention to our physical bodies and instead focus on our essence, what we call spirits that will survive forever. And it's a beautiful message of hope, because when we kill death, we kill all our worries and we connect love. Because when there is no death, there is only love. And all the love that you have built in this world will continue even if you're not in it anymore. And you would then realize that you've had other loves before in many different lifetimes. And they have never been disconnected either. And so you start to begin to assess the magnitude of love in our road to self-fulfillment, and we see that it just keeps going up. It just keeps growing. We have the love of those who are near us. We have the love of those who have departed us from this lifetime. We have the love of those we lived with before and then we don't even remember who they are. And we will have the love of those who we are still yet to meet in lives in the future. All we have is love, and a lot of it. But we forget. We forget all of this. And ultimately, what we aim to get as we place ourselves in Paul's footsteps is, what is our road to Damascus? What is your road to Damascus? Where in the road to Damascus are you? What are the stumbling blocks in your life? What are the things that are holding you back? Are you ready to accept that things will be blinding, destabilizing, and hard, but that you will be able to overcome this when you make that courageous decision? That you are never alone, and that you will arrive at your own Damascus, whatever it may be. You see, we don't know what each other's roads to Damascus are. All we know is that all of us are in one, and we temporarily cross. And we also know there is a God that will lead and deliver us safely. So we must trust. And in a particular way, as we celebrate the 10 years of the Spiritist Society of Chicago today, we can say that this is the rest stop along a road to Damascus. This is the place that not a lot of people are given, when they can come and rest their weary feet and see for a second, even though we're blind, with other people around us who are also together in the road to Damascus. This is the place that we come to breathe in the clear air of spirituality and remind us, even if it's for an hour of our week, that we are spirits. And that fuels our tank so that we may continue on our road to Damascus more than we can imagine. And so as we embrace that reality, the spiritual reality, we sometimes fret that there is so much ahead of us that we don't know, and we forget that there is so much already that we have conquered. Whatever it is that we may be in our road to Damascus, it's important for us to remember that love is always there. That you will be successful. It's a matter of time. So the question that we ask ourselves, how much time do we want to take in our road to Damascus? What will make us get there? And as we break the barriers of the visible into the invisible, we can only raise our hearts to God and to our older brother, the Christ, who through all our challenges and through all our blindness has always been with us. We feel moments of that presence sometimes when we struggle. We feel the presence of the invisible ones who have come to point us in the right direction. They cannot do the walking for us, but they can point us in the right way. And that's what we're doing. We're just walking together. And it's a beautiful thing. So I hope from the bottom of my heart that the example from Paul, who continues to watch over us, as does Peter and all those who have trekked this passage before, as Susanna also shared, may continue to remind us that this place is an oasis in the middle of the desert. And we ask God to continue to bless all who come here in the both planes of life, to replenish their hearts, their minds, to clean their feet, to have a moment of relaxation before getting back on the road. And I hope that more and more we can do just that. Meet in places like this, talk about important things, and help each other as we move forward. There's so much to be thankful for. There's so much to be grateful for. There's so much that you guys have already done together. I only dream of being granted the honor of visiting you in the future to seeing how much farther ahead will you be on your road to Damascus.